Hey there, this is Kara Jane with Ice Cream for Buttercream, and today we are talking about how to stack a cake. Now, there are several different methods for stacking cakes, but today I want to go through how I like to stack them. And you can try out several different methods to see which one you like the best, but I'm just going to go through what I like to do. Okay, first we want to talk about the supplies that you're going to need in order to stack a cake. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is cake bases. And the cake base is not the cake board. That's not what's going to go directly under each tier of the cake. This is the actual cake base. This is going to go under all of the tiers. So it's actually the very bottom of your cake. So you'll have your larger cake base that's heavier and sturdier, and then you'll have another cake board, which we'll get to in just a minute, with your tier of cake on top of it. So the cake base is really important. You just want to make sure that it's going to be sturdy enough to hold the weight of your cake. It's really important to think about how heavy your cake's going to be. If it's going to be covered in fondant and ganache, it's going to be heavier. And we'll get a little bit more into what cake bases I like to use in just a minute. Okay, the next supply would be cake boards. That's different than the cake base. Remember, the cake base is on the very bottom, and a cake board is going to be under each tier of cake. And if you're unsure about the difference between cake layers and cake tiers are made up of cake layers. And so I like to use 3 layers to make a tier, and under each tier there's going to be a cake board. And so if that is still a little bit confusing to you, I'm going to put a link in the description below for another video that I have called The Anatomy of a Cake, and it kind of goes into more detail about that. Okay, the next supply is dowels, and there are a couple of different types of dowels that you can use for your cake. I like to use the plastic, and some people call them poly dowels, and they usually come in 2 different sizes. The white dowels over on the left are a little bit thicker, and then the yellow dowels are a little bit thinner, but they are kind of a harder plastic. But I really like these because they're hollow in the middle, and so when you insert them into the cake, they don't displace any cake. And what I mean is, like, if you use a wooden dowel, it moves the cake away. I like the really hollow dowels, and these plastic ones are really very sturdy. And another option to use is bubble tea straws, and these are not as heavy duty as the poly dowels or the plastic dowels, but they do work. You just want to make sure that you don't put super heavy tiers on top of them. I wouldn't suggest using them in a 3-tiered cake. I mean, maybe some people have done it and have been successful, but if it's going to be a heavier cake, I really prefer to use the plastic or the poly dowels because they're much sturdier. But bubble tea straws will work for just a 2-layer cake, something like that that's not going to be super heavy. And these are much easier than the plastic dowels. The plastic or the poly dowels, you really have to kind of use like some larger clippers, metal clippers, to cut them. But the bubble tea straws, you can just use scissors to cut them. And then another option would be the wooden dowels, which I do not like to use. They are kind of a pain to cut, and they sort of splinter. And then when you put them in there, they have a tendency to shift a little bit. I just really don't like to use the wooden dowels. Some people use them and they love them. So you just pick out what you want to try first. Try it out. If you like it, that's great. If you don't, just go on to the next method and try something else out. Okay, and other stacking systems, besides using straight dowels, they call them stacking systems. And for example, it would be like the SPS stacking system, and you can Google that. It'll kind of give you some more information about that, and the Wilton stacking system. These are sort of column-based things with little plastic plates that are attached to the columns, and you push that down into a cake layer and put the other. And there are a lot of cake decorators who really prefer this method. I have heard great things about the SPS stacking system. Say that fast 5 times in a row. But I have heard great things about it, and people say that it really keeps your cake from shifting on you. So if you want to try that out, go ahead and try that out. You will have to adjust your pricing if you are selling so that it includes that, because you're not going to get that stacking system back. You're going to have to up your price a little bit to include that with your cake. Okay, so the next supply you're going to need is a cake leveler or a knife. And this you just want to make sure that your cake layers are flat on the top, because if you have a dome or a hump on your cake or whatever and you go to ice it, you're going to have all kinds of issues with the cake leaning. You've got to get a level cake all the way around if you're going to stack it. All right, the next one is a turntable, and this is just a cake turntable. You can get a cheap Wilton one, and that's what I started out with, and they do work. I still use it, actually. I have one of these metal ones now, but the Wilton one still works fine. So it doesn't matter. You just need some kind of turntable that's really going to help you, not necessarily stack the cake, but that's going to help you decorate the cake and add your buttercream or your ganache or whatever it is that you're adding to your cake. That's going to help you get a smooth finish on it. All right, and then again, icing spatulas and smoothers, that's also going to help you get a smooth finish on your cake. You just want that top of your cake to be as level as possible. And here are some supplies that may seem a little bit out of the ordinary, but this, again, I'm just sharing with you the method that I like to use to stack cakes, and I like to use candy melts. You can use hot glue, but of course that's not going to touch any of the cake, but that's how you're going to attach the bottom tier to your cake base, is either some hot glue or some candy melts. I prefer to use candy melts so that everything is pretty much edible. Not that they're going to eat the bottom cake base, but it's just handy, and I also use it in other parts of this tutorial, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And then the next thing is an edible marker, and it needs to be edible, and you can find these on Amazon as well, but you want an edible marker because once you stick in your dowels, you are going to mark where the top of the cake is in my method. I don't just like to stick in the dowel, pull the dowel out, and then cut it. I want to make sure that I'm actually marking exactly where I need to cut it, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Okay, and next you're going to either need scissors or large metal cutters. I don't really know what those things are called, maybe like clippers. I'm not sure if you know exactly what they're called. Wire cutters maybe. I'm not exactly sure. So, and mine don't look exactly like they're brand new, so just ignore that. I've used them for quite some time. But if you use the bubble tea straws, you're going to just need scissors. You don't really need any large wire cutters or anything to cut them. But if you're going to use the plastic pillars or the poly dowels, you're going to need something heavier duty to cut them. And then I like to use a small level. This is really, really important. And you can find these little mini levels at any of your home improvement stores. This is going to be really important because you have to make sure each tier is level before you go start stacking everything on it. Even when you add your dowels, you're going to still make sure that that cake is still level after you've added your dowels. And we'll go through that in just a minute. So now I'll talk about the cake base. And remember, this is the very bottom that all of your tiers are going to go on. Your entire cake is going to sit on this cake base. And so like I said before, you want to make sure that your cake, whatever the weight of your cake, your final cake is going to be, you need to keep that in mind when you're picking out your base. So what I like to do is to use foam core boards. And for the very base of the cake, I like to use the 1/2-inch foam core boards. I have used this on very heavy cakes, and it is surprisingly sturdy. So you can try it out, see if you like it. They have 1/2-inch foam core boards, and then they have 1/4-inch foam core boards, and we'll talk about the 1/4-inch in just a minute, but I really like the foam core. It's really, really sturdy. And I also like to use the boards, make sure that, let's say your bottom tier is going to be a 10-inch cake, I will at least get the base of it 12 inches. So that gives an inch around the entire cake, so an inch on each side around the perimeter of the bottom cake. And then sometimes I'll even go higher if I want more room, so 14 or whatever inches. But you can also use, some cakers will use MDF board, and that's really helpful too if you've got a super heavy cake. That's actual wood, or composite wood, I think, but it's really heavy duty. That thing is not going to buckle. You can be sure that it's going to be sturdy enough to carry your cake on. All right, for the cake boards, which is the actual cake board that's going to go under each tier, that you want the exact same size as your tier. So if you have a 6-inch tier on the top, you want a 6-inch cake board right underneath it. And the same for the bottom tier. You want it the same size. And for these, you can just use the regular cardboard cake rounds. or you can use the foam core. And then right here I'm showing you the foam core boards, and I really love to use these. They are the 1/4 inch foam core. If I'm doing a cake that's going to be covered in ganache and then it's also going to be covered in fondant, it's going to be pretty heavy. And these I know are not going to buckle. There's the buttercream, or the cake is not going to the moisture's not going to sort of soak into the cake board if it's a cardboard. It just gives me a lot, it makes me more confident when I use the foam core boards, but I use the 1/4 inch between the different tiers. But like I said, you can also use the cardboard. It just depends on how heavy your cake is and what you like to use. Okay, so I'm just taking my cake base, which is the very bottom that everything is going to sit on, and I'm covering it in some paper. And I'm going to do a more detailed video on how I like to do this. I like to cover it in contact paper as well. That way you can use any type of paper underneath it. You're not just using some kind of fancy foil or anything like that. And now I have my turntable, and I'm just going to put just a plain cardboard cake round on top of it, and that's just kind of my working board. And then I'm going to put my foam core board on top of that, and that's what I'm actually going to build this tier on. And I'm just using a little bit of melted candy melts to stick that bottom layer of cake onto the cake board. It helps keep things from shifting on me. You can also use buttercream if you want to. I find that the candy melt kind of helps it stay a little bit more firm instead of kind of moving around on me like buttercream will do. And now I'm just sort of building the cake is what I like to call it. We're just stacking it and filling it. And so I like to use 3 layers of cake and 2 layers of buttercream. And I just like to do a really thin crumb coat on it. And then I like to let it settle. And I like to let it settle because that way it's going to get all of the air out of it. It's going to go ahead and squish out any filling it needs to squish out. Then I can go and correct it and then add the final coating of buttercream on it. Or I can add on my ganache and then cover it in fondant and everything. But I find that letting the cake settle is really, really important in cake decorating, because if you completely decorate it, you can come back and the cake settles on you, and then you have bulges or blowouts and stuff like that happening to you. And I go into a little bit more detail in the blog post, and I can put a link to that in the description below too, on why I don't chill my cakes while I'm decorating. So for the most part, unless it has perishable ingredients, I don't like to chill it because that firms it up too much. And I want it to go ahead and settle, do its thing now, rather than after I've decorated the cake and it's sitting out ready to be served. Okay, so I'm just working on the top tier, and the bottom tier for this cake is just an 8-inch cake, and this top tier right here is just a 6-inch round cake, and I'm just doing the same thing. I'm going to do a light crumb coat, and then I'm going to let it settle before I cover it with ganache. And a quick note on the cake base, I really like to do this on the cake bases. This is going to sound weird, but I kind of learned this method. I saw Lauren Kitchens do it in a Craftsy class that I took, and I think it's called Blueprint now. And I really, her explanation for it really made sense, and so I just started to do it. Whether it's helpful or not, or whether you want to try it, that's up to you. But I like to cut out a little circle in the middle of my cake board. And I'm not cutting into the cake board, I'm just cutting off the paper in a little circle. Because when I stick the cake, that bottom cake tier on it, I want that to be stuck to the board and not just the paper. And so I cut out that paper, a little circle in the middle, and then I kind of take down around the edges. And then that way, when I put my melted candy melt or hot glue down, that bottom tier is actually stuck to the board and not just glued down to the paper. So I hope that made sense. You can try it out if you want to, but I find that it really kind of gives me a little bit of comfort that my cake it feels a little sturdier to me. All right, so we're back to the cake, and I am just showing just a little bit. I'm covering this cake in ganache, and then I'm going to add some fondant over it. I have 2 tutorials that I'm going to link in the description, and there are videos on how to ganache a cake and get straight sides on it, and I have sort of a cheater method that can help you do that really easily. And then the next video is tips on covering a cake in fondant and how to do that. And so don't forget to check the description for those links. All right, so now I am adding the bottom tier to my cake board, and remember I like to use a little bit of candy melts, some melted candy melts in the middle, and then I'm going to use my large icing spatula to sort of pick up my cake and then set it onto that bottom baseboard. And I don't go ahead and pull out that large spatula, I leave that underneath it because that's going to help me move it around to make sure that it is in the middle. Now, if you're using a buttercream cake, you can chill the buttercream cake right before you add it for a little bit. That way it's kind of chilled and it's a little bit more firm. It's easier to kind of maneuver it around. But if you're using a fondant cake, those are much easier to stack because you can kind of put your hand on it and you're not going to mess up a whole lot of things. All right, so now let's talk about the different dowels. And remember, this is a bubble tea straw, and you can use scissors to just cut those. But for today's tutorial, I want to show you how I like to use the poly dowels. And so I've got a larger white poly dowel here, and you can see it's a pretty thick dowel and it's very sturdy. You're not going to be able to bend it or anything. And just remember, you have to use those thicker clippers or cutters to be able to cut this. And then the next option are these really thin, I think they call them buttercream dowels, but they're still poly dowels. They're really thick plastic. You can't bend those either. It looks like it might be flimsy, but it's not. So I'm just going to use those two for today, and this is probably going to be a little overkill to stack a 6-inch cake. But I'm going to use this because I want to show you how I like to use these poly dowels. And I like to use the sort of wider or larger poly dowels, a couple of those, and then put the little ones in between them. And now I'm just taking a cake board, and it's the same size as that top tier that's just going to be sitting on this cake, and I like to set it on the top in the middle and kind of just do a little indentation with a little toothpick just to show me where the edges of that top cake are going to be, so that I know exactly where to push in my dowels. And then I'm just going to push in the first dowel, and these are the large ones. Just push it in, and I'm going to mark it with my edible marker and then kind of twist it as I pull it out of the cake. And you'll notice there's going to be cake inside there. Don't take it out or anything. Just leave it like it is. And then cut off where you marked it. And then I'm going to sort of measure the next section along with that first section and mark it. Now, the reason we're doing this is because we don't want to add all these dowels in and then pull them up and cut them. We want each section of the dowel, each dowel to be the exact same height. Because your cake may not be completely level, but you want your dowels to be level. And so I'm doing this a few times with the white poly dowels and a few times with the yellow poly dowels. Again, this is probably going to be overkill with that many dowels, but I really wanted to show you how to do it with multiple dowels. And so I'm going to stick the original one back in, and then I'm going to add in the other dowels and just keep track of where you're adding everything and make sure you're not going outside of that line that you kind of drew earlier with your toothpick. And I left the middle part open right here in case, now you don't have to do this every time, but I just wanted to sort of demonstrate what you would need to do if you were going to add a center dowel. And you can check out my video on how to do a tall cake or how to make a tall cake in which you would put a center dowel in the middle. That kind of stabilizes it. So if you have a really tall cake or you just want extra stability and you're going to kind of hammer in a long center dowel once you've gotten everything stacked, you would want that middle part to not have a dowel there. Now, if I'm not going to use a center dowel, I'm not going to leave that part bare. I'm going to put a center dowel in there. And it doesn't matter if you use a larger dowel there or a smaller dowel, I would just put something there. But like I said, I just wanted to show you for demonstration purposes that I would leave that area without a dowel if I thought I was going to put in a center dowel. All right, and the next thing that you want to do is you want to go ahead and set a cake board on top of it again, and then use your mini level just to set on top of it and see if things are level. If they're not level, you can pull them up with some small little wire, I don't know what these are called, pliers, I guess, and pull them up and then trim off a little bit if you need to, but you always want to make sure that it's level. Always test it. So stick another board on top of there and use your level to see if it's level. Okay, and I wanted to go through another method that I see a lot of cake decorators use as well. I don't particularly use it, but there's nothing wrong with it. So I'm just going to pull a couple of these up a little bit with my pliers, but a lot of times once you make sure it's level, you can pull them up a little bit, the dowels, and then when you set your cake on top of it, you have room for your fingers underneath it. And this is especially useful if you've got a buttercream cake you're adding. So you can have your fingers underneath that top cake tier and then stack it on top of your cake, and then or use your buttercream spatula underneath it, but there's more room underneath it, and you can set it on those dowels, and the weight of that top tier will push those dowels back down to the cake or back down into the cake. And so a lot of people use that. I haven't really used it, but there's nothing wrong with it. So you can try that out and see how you like that as well. I just like sticking the cake directly on top of the dowels as they're already pushed down into the cake. But that's your call. Okay, so I'm just going to add a little bit of candy melts to it so that the top tier doesn't kind of move around on me. And even if I have a dowel in the middle, I still do this. I just kind of put it around that dowel. And then I'm using my spatula, and you can put your hand underneath it a little bit if it's a buttercream cake to kind of hold it. But if it's a fondant cake, I'm holding the back end of it because it's not going to really mess up anything. And then I keep my spatula underneath it until I get it exactly where I need it, and then I will kind of lift it up a bit and pull out that spatula, and then adjust that top tier if you need to. If it's fondant, again, you can use your hands to move it. If it's buttercream, it's really best to go ahead and chill those cakes before you stack them. If it's a buttercream cake, it just works easier to do it that way. Okay, so let's go through some final thoughts and tips on stacking cakes. Make sure that you're going to use a sturdy cake base. Just pay attention to how heavy that final cake is going to be, and make sure that if you are going to use cardboard cake rounds for the base, that you have attached together multiple cardboard rounds. And if you are at all hesitant on whether it's heavy or not, or sturdy enough, you want to get something different, like a foam core. And I don't mean styrofoam, that's not sturdy. Foam core is actually really, it's really compacted and it's very sturdy. So get something like that, or get an actual cake drum. Now, some of the cake drums that you can get at your hobby stores, they are also not strong enough, as I have found out the hard way. So know what's in that drum. So if you get a foam core cake board, you know that that's going to be sturdy. You don't want to be getting any kind of foam core at the dollar store or anything like that. I really like to get mine from Global Sugar Art, and I know that there are other places you can get it as well. They're not cheap boards, but you don't want a cheap board, because then your cake is going to collapse if your bottom cake base collapses. So pay attention to that, and even if you want to go with a wood base or a MDF board, that will work as well. Okay, so also, if you, like I said earlier, if you're using a buttercream cake, make sure to chill it before you stack it. It's much easier that way, and you're less likely to kind of goof on it while you're stacking it. Keep that spatula underneath it and kind of maneuver it around until you get it in the spot you want it, and then pull the spatula out. That really seems to help me. Make sure your cakes are level, both before you add your dowels and then after you add your dowels. Put that extra cardboard cake round on top with your level on there, and make sure that it's level, because if the bottom tier is not level, it's going to get worse as you go up. So you have to have everything level. And then, like I said, you want to measure each dowel from that first dowel. It doesn't matter that maybe one dowel is sticking up a little bit higher on the cake than the other, because a part of that cake may not be completely level. So it really helps to stick that other cake board on top of it and then test it with your level to see if that is level. I hope that makes sense. Just remember, you can always send me a comment and ask me questions. If any of this is confusing, I'm happy to help. Okay, and then the next tip is just to practice and figure out what method works for you. Like I said, there's a bunch of different methods. You can pull up the dowels a little bit, set the cake on it, and let it push the dowels back into the cake. A lot of people like to do that. And then there are other stacking systems like the SPS stacking system, and that people really love to use. And look that up and just kind of figure out your own style of doing things. And make sure to check out the other videos in the description below about anatomy of a decorated cake, how to ganache a cake, how to cover a cake in fondant. I've also got a post on tips for cake boards. It's got all kinds of different variations of how to decorate cake boards, and I'm also coming out with a video about how to cover a cake board. I'm really going into depth on how I like to do that, because you can essentially cover it in anything as long as you put something over that that's going to kind of make it grease proof. And I'm going to show how I like to do that and a couple of little additions to the bottom of the cake board that make it easier to move around. Okay, my friends, I hope this was really helpful for you. If you have any questions, concerns, or just need some clarification on something, just be sure to put a comment below. Let me know, and I will be happy to help you. And I will see you next time.